Hey everyone, it's Lou Rosenfeld. Welcome to the latest edition of the Rosenfeld Review podcast. And I am with Mr. Steve Porgal. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Lou.
Oh my God, you've got your podcast voice going. You sound very excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk. That's it.
Are you excited to talk? Are you excited to talk about something in particular, or most likely are you excited to talk with me?
I'm excited to talk with you, Lou.
Well, thanks. Well, I'm excited to talk with you too, Steve, but let's just cut to the chase and be honest. The truth is you have a new book out. Those of you who are listening probably already have a copy of Steve's first book that we also published, Interviewing Users, which not only has my all-time favorite Rosenfeld Media cover, and there's a lot of good ones, but I like to describe it as a classic. I think, I don't know what makes a classic. I don't even know what it would need to sell or what people would need to say about it, but it seems to have really kind of filled a void in the canon of books in our space. And I'm hoping that your follow-up book does similarly well. I know that I'm really enjoying it. I enjoyed it in its pre-book form, and I'm enjoying it now in book form. And the book is Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries, User Research War Stories. And it just came out a couple weeks ago. This is December of 2016, if you're wondering. Steve, this is like a compilation in a sense, and somehow you convinced me to publish a compilation because I tend to be very anti-compilation. But I think it's also more than that. Why don't you talk about the genesis of pulling together all these war stories, and then we can talk about how they made it from an idea to an actual book.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll use my normal voice because I can't sustain that voice. When I look back, I sort of see two, points of origin. One is a time that I was at a conference many years ago, and people are at the bar in the evening, as often happens, and we just started telling stories. And I hadn't been doing user research for very long, and not many of us had been doing user research for very long. It was a less, well-established thing than it is today. And we started describing sort of weird, interesting, unusual things that had happened to us. And it was like a neat moment. Wow, we have these things in common. And, again, just an old enough time in the field that we weren't on Slack channels and Twitter. Those things didn't exist. And so we weren't necessarily as well connected with each other. And this period of telling stories and exchanging things that were not about the work, but were about what it meant to live the life of doing the work, I guess, just really struck me. It gave me a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And I sort of held on to that moment like, talking about this stuff and this other stuff that we never talk about. Because during the day at the conference, people are presenting their case studies and their successes and, their best practices. And at the bar, we're talking about, oh, yeah, this thing happened to me. So there's others. Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, so I want you to just sort of color in the story a little bit more. Was there a particular conference or a few conferences you found yourself at where the subject came up, and what were you drinking?
Well, if I was like really suave, I would like drop the name of some cocktail. I was having a Harvey Wallbanger neat. I don't know if that's a thing you can even have neat. It actually was the Thought at Work conference, which was a student-run conference that the people at Rochester Institute of Technology put on. And that was the first time I met Alan Chochnov, who writes the foreword for this book and is one of my favorite people. Virginia Prestrel was speaking at that conference, an author, writes all kinds of things about design and culture and society. Yves Bahar was one of the speakers from Fuse Project before he was a cover model for Wired and everywhere else. It was early days, and if you sort of look at who was there, and I don't remember exactly who was talking what at the bar about user research, but this maybe was 2003 if I had to put a year on it. So that was kind of the one point of origin, I guess, for the stories, and it sort of planted a seed in my head that these stories are interesting and that I wonder about, talking about them more formally. And then you flash forward, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years later, Dan Salzberg was working for me and came back from a day of field work and started telling me about how he kneeled in cat pee and how he was trying to keep the participant from knowing that he had kneeled in cat pee so that the guy wouldn't feel bad. And it was all this empathy moment of, sort of looming over him with the camera. Dan used to be a filmmaker, and he sensed like this is the Oscar moment. The guy was giving this big impassioned speech, and Dan is realizing, oh, I'm standing above him while he sits on the couch. I'm going to go for eye level to kind of and go in for this shot, but maintain the sense of empathy, I guess, with the body language. And so Dan kneels down, realizes he's in cat pee, doesn't know what to do, ends up trying to conceal that by where he puts his knee when he stands up, and then runs off to do another interview.
So you can,
like this very meticulous.
You can take the user researcher out of cat pee, but you can't take it out of his pants. So
no, not while you're in the field. And it was just such a great story, and it was such a great, we had work to do and things to be reported, and we talked about all the learnings and the impact for the project and what our client needed to know. But I was just really struck by what happened to Dan, why it happened to him, what he did about it, how he thought about it. And it just seemed like this really interesting story that said so much more than it took me further than I think we were at the bar. Like there was something else going on here, and I didn't necessarily know what it was. And I looked for ways to try to get people together to tell, I would call them failure stories at the time. And we had a proposal into South by Southwest that didn't quite really get accepted. We ended up doing something else. But every time I would pitch this to people, they would start to respond and say, oh yeah, I've got a lot of stories. So that made me feel that there was certainly, sort of a marketplace of contributors out there, and there was probably an audience because there was something interesting going on. So I didn't take like a concrete step with this until I was finishing the classic Interviewing Users, as you characterized it. And, one of the things I wanted to say in that book is, hey, there's a way that we can learn. And in addition to all this information, which is maybe more pedagogical in structure, just by sharing these stories, we can learn other things. We can learn about what is really going on. And, you had, I think, encouraged all of us authors to create some kind of hooks in the book. Like how will the book grow and live online after the book is published? And so that was my little thing. And so I started soliciting stories. I had to make sure that when the book was out in the world, if you went to that URL, you'd see something there. So I hit up as many people as I could, and that was, I guess, in 2012. So in the intervening 4 years, I've collected, I guess, close to 70 stories, and that sort of have been sitting in a blog format, just sort of, sitting and being read and so on. But this kind of archive, but not really a processed archive. I'm going to keep going, Lou, but I think this is where we talk about how does a bill become a law? How do those stories become a book?
Yeah, before we get to that, was there any criteria that you had in place for what you accepted on the website, or was it just pretty much anything?
Yeah, so that's a great point. What do we mean by war stories? I think because the focus of Interviewing Users was about contextual user research, I wanted these to be fieldwork stories. People would, approach me with, hey, here's the thing that happened in a usability test. Here's the thing that happened in a focus group. And I would always encourage them to collect and post those stories somewhere. But this archive was really focused on what happens when you leave your world and go into someone else's world. Like that's what opens up the possibilities for challenges. Mm-hmm. And I also have long said that these are stories about the researcher, not the research. I think a tendency is sometimes to share a case study. We had this business question, we gained these insights, we created this impact or this new design. And, I've been encouraging people to tell the other stories. What happened to you when you were doing field work? What did you encounter? What did you experience? What are sort of these other stories about the experience? And so I think those were the main criteria. Something about you. It didn't need to reveal anything confidential. It's about going out in the field. And I also encouraged people not to lean too heavily on pulling lessons out of these stories. Like sometimes just saying, hey, this is what happened is sufficient. And I think especially researchers who are, we are storytellers as part of the profession, and we are advocates. And I think there's a lot of teaching as well. So you would often get these stories that had, here's 7 points that the story revealed. And, my sort of curator feedback would be like, well, less of what you learned and more of what happened.
Why is that? Why did you not encourage them to come up with lessons from their experiences?
Because I think there's a certain power in just the story. And this may be a segue to, what we ended up doing, how the compilation became what it is. But I think, this original format of letting someone tell a story. I did this, a story has a beginning, a middle, and end. And the proportion that you would use and the moral of the story is very slight. Like, that's what makes for a good story. You go to see, Kurosawa. What's the most pretentious filmmaker name I can drop here? Like I know anything about it. There are epilogues and there's denouement, but there's not, recapping what you need to take away from the story. The story itself teaches you that. And so if we're trying to step away from traditional pedagogical structures for teaching and just letting things reveal what they reveal, then just let that be the story. And they started to get just really sort of redundant and a little ponderous when I would see what people would put in. It's like, no, we don't need more of the 7 lessons here in this story. Your story is jaw-dropping, so let's sort of celebrate your story and bring your story out.
So what was the trigger for you to then say, we have a book here, or I think we have a book here? I think you were up to around 60 at that point. Was it the number?
No. I in fact had been resisting the idea of it being a book. People would say, oh, are you going to do a book about this? And, I think there was, the experience of writing and publishing and getting the reception to interviewing users was just in terms of the arc of my own career was really significant. And so I didn't really know, well, if that's what a book is like, what does another book look like? And what do you do for a follow-up? I thought that was sort of something I just wanted to stay away from. I just wasn't really ready to engage with that idea. And I don't know if someone said to me, you should, and that was enough to sort of make me revisit it. And I think, also what happens is, it's, the web is great and you have things in a blog and there's a URL and people can go read them. I think those stories were ephemeral, even though there's a place for them and you can still find them there. They would come out, I would tweet them, people would read them, they'd react to them, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And they're sort of getting lost in the, in a blog is not sort of the hippest thing anymore. They were getting lost. And so thinking about what do we do with this body, this corpus, and it seemed like, all right, the initial, the initial idea for me was literally to compile them, was to kind of concatenate them with, a page for me saying like, this is so-and-so story about this, and really just put them from one form into another. And if they could be put into a book, an ebook or a physical book, then the aggregate of this archive could take on a new life because it could be experienced as one thing as opposed to trawling back through an archives, which no one was doing. So that seemed like, oh, that's pretty easy. I should just do that. And that's kind of, I think, what I came to you with, and you pushed back on me.
My feeling about compilations, and I'm not quite ready to say this is a compilation, by the way, but my understanding when you came to me was that it certainly could be, and that it had many voices. And I probably have a conversation once or twice a week with someone interested in a book that is a collection of some stuff that might be interesting. And, there are great compilations, but for the most part, when they make it into book form, they're not. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the author is really acting more as an editor and doesn't express a strong point of view, doesn't serve as a guide to the reader through the material, just sort of tees it up and gets out of the way. And then what that does is it often exposes just sort of the inconsistencies and in some case redundancies between all those various pieces that they're compiling. And it just, like, it starts to get kind of boring. And I don't know, I've seen a lot of these compilations that are just not very useful or very good. And so, you scared me when you came to me, but I don't know, the more we talked about it, the more I felt like there was something else that it could be beyond a compilation.
Yeah, and I remember you saying to me that, the interesting book, the book that, Rosenfeld Media would want to do would be the book of what I would have to say about these stories. That caught me by surprise a little bit.
Well, I remember pushing you to come up with some greater truths about doing field research. I didn't know if you were A, sure of what they would be. I don't think so when you started. Or B, sure that you would even come up with anything. But Steve, I had a lot of faith in you, that you were going to create some sum that was greater than the parts once you'd gone through the process of combing through them and looking for patterns and great, as I said, greater truths. And I think I'm the publisher, so I'm going to hawk Steve's book. I am obviously biased, but Steve has created 11 chapters, each with his own perspective, and then usually anywhere from 3 to 6, 7 stories for each chapter that fit that perspective, that illustrate that principle. And I sat down with the book when I had it in my hot hands, and it was pretty obvious to me that those 11 chapters are the kind of greater truths of doing field research. Are you overwhelmed by my...
I'm verklempt. Thank you, Lou. That's the process you're describing is what was just, I think, really fun about this book. People ask if writing a book is hard. This was really, it was like a joyful process of creation, I think, and that was sort of the task you set before me. I don't know, how do we say that? That's where you sent me, is like, find what you have to say about it. And it's, I had been doing speaking events about the war stories for a couple of years. It's not like I had never reflected on it, but I think the level of reflection, really taking a complete step back and, seeing what were the themes, what were the patterns, and what did they lend themselves, and what did I want to say about it? It's funny, I said that I had asked the storytellers not to put lessons too much into their stories, but that was, I think, some direction from you and your team was, you need to tell people what to take away from these, which I also resisted, just because my brain wasn't there yet. But I think each chapter, I don't know, this, I'm going to hawk it a little bit too. I think, me talking about the themes, and then these stories which illustrate these themes in very different ways, and then me coming back and saying, like, here's 5 or 10 things to think about. They aren't always, easy action items. Sometimes they're just mental models to build for yourself to understand how to make choices in really complex situations. But I think that structure of an essay, a bunch of stories, a bunch of takeaways, I mean, that is the book. And so as you go through these 11 chapters, you get all of that. And as, again, to create that, it was very gratifying for me. And the response so far has been really positive, and it feels like, all right, there is something here. I think stories, this is just a set of stories. It is not all the stories. And, one of the outcomes I'm hoping for is that this kicks loose some more stories, whether they send them to us and we publish them, at rosenfeldmedia.com, or people get together and go to a bar just to talk about stories, but that people use stories to do something additional than because I sort of getting at this before, right? There's other ways of learning here, but I think what these stories also have to offer is they're stories where things go wrong often, or they go differently than what you expected. And these are stories about successful, competent, talented, experienced researchers doing all the right things and still having things go wrong. And so you can look at these stories and you can think about, I think there's a lot of judgment that happens. Maybe you wouldn't have done that. Maybe you would. But you start to have empathy. And I know that's just an overused word, but I'm going to use it here anyway. You start to have some forgiveness or some acceptance of what happened to that person. If a successful, talented, competent person can do everything right and still have things happen, like when Nicholas Nova encounters a hungry, newly released from prison guy when he's doing interviews at a fast food restaurant, who kind of comes up to them and shouts at them. You can't fault Nicholas for that. That's the nature of contextual research, as things happen. And so you start to think, well, okay, Nicholas can't control everything, and he's at the top of his game, and it's okay. Like, that's what's going to happen. That's what research looks like. I'm probably going to have a situation myself where I did everything right and something, quote, wrong still happened, and maybe that's okay. And it doesn't mean that we do crap work in research, but that we acknowledge that our work takes place in this very uncontrollable context, and that, not everything is going to be as dramatic as, someone released from prison, but these moments of loss of control or things breaking down happen. It's just research is hard, and humans are complex and imperfect, and we're imperfect. And to have that be a way that we, as people doing research, participating in, all of us kind of in user experience space, as large as you want to kind of draw that, if we can consider research that way, we can get on with it and not be scared of recrimination from others or kind of holding ourselves back. But I think we can grow as a practice just by talking about what happens and kind of sharing the reality of it.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, and when I was reading it occurred to me that you were kind of helping us understand not only how to be empathetic for the people we were observing, and obviously how to be empathetic for ourselves, but that it's a microcosm to some degree for just how we interact with people. So the fact that you don't have control necessarily as much as you might plan for in interactions, the fact that people are exasperating and that you have to be prepared for it. Sometimes they're gross. Sometimes they'll put you in danger, or you'll put yourself in danger without realizing it. Sometimes you'll be in situations with people that will force you to question your morals and your ethics. Those are all basically principles that you're covering with these chapters, and I think obviously if you're like a student starting out, or maybe a junior person in any type of user research, this is helpful. But I think really, anyone is going to learn something about themselves and about people from a book like this. And I think we can wrap this up. And I don't want to, we're kind of pushing past my magical 20-minute mark. But I will tell you that when one of the times I picked it up in book form was actually on the subway here in New York City, and had some time to kill at a long trip. Normally I'd be looking at my iPhone, but my iPhone was dead. I was on my way to the Apple Store, as a matter of fact, and I was like, "Wow, I have a book. It's been designed to be read on places like a subway, short trips." And I dipped in, and the stories and your essays are very short and modular and easy to digest, but there was something else about else that was magical about that experience, which was reading it on the subway, surrounded by people who could be subjects, just people of all types, because the New York subway is very diverse in terms of who's on it. And I was just wanting to do a study right on the spot and just grab some people or just observe some people sitting on the train it really inspired me, and I want to thank you for that, Steve. And thank you for not only putting the book together, but to just be kind enough and generous enough with the community to encourage people to share their stories and to collect them, even before they came out in book form.
Thanks, Lou. I think I'm not going to add anything. That's a lovely way to leave us. So thank you.
Cool. Well, Steve Portigal's Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries, User Research War Stories, available from Rosenfeld Media, obviously. You can pick it up from Amazon as well. And I think you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll pick a copy up. Thanks again, Steve.